hello. I didn't see you there. I was just going over my externalities. Do you guys know about externalities? No? Well, shame on you. An externality is an activity of one entity that affects the welfare of another entity in a way that is outside the market mechanism. Pollution is the prime example most economics think of when discussing externalities. There are many different ways to address these from a public economics perspective, including emission fees, which is Pigovian taxes, incentives, such as subsidies, cap and trade, which is tradable permits, and command and control regulation. My colleagues and I will further explain all of these ideas as we take a journey around the city and show you examples.
Thanks, Dax. I'm going to start off with negative externalities, which occur when production and/or consumption impose external costs on third parties, outside of the market which no appropriate compensation is paid. An example of negative externality would be pollution at the park, which would affect everybody living around the park. I'm good with that.
This is an example of a negative externality graph. As you can see, the social cost is greater than the private cost.
Thank you, Mikey. Unlike negative externalities, positive externalities yield benefits. And an example would be a park, because it would raise the prices of the neighborhood surrounding it.
Here's an example of a positive externality graph. As you can see, the social benefit is greater than the private benefit.
One way that Dax mentioned to deal with externalities was through the Coase theorem, which is a famous result called the Coase theorem after the economist Ronald Coase, which suggests that it can be very effective in some circumstances for private markets to deal with the problem themselves. According to the Coase theorem, private markets can bargain without the cost of overall allocations of resources, then the private market will always solve the problem of externalities and allocate resources efficiently. A good example of the Coase theorem would be this restaurant behind me paying the park to be able to pollute in the lake. The Coase theorem is when two private parties come to an agreement without any additional cost to themselves.
Command and control policies regulation regulates behavior directly. The government can remedy an externality by making certain behaviors either required or forbidden. For example, Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, is the United States government agency that develops and enforces regulations aimed at protecting the environment. The EPA dictates maximum level of pollution that a factory may emit, and they require firms to adopt a particular technology to reduce emissions.
To sum it up, command and control is when the government steps in and says what can and can't be done. As I mentioned earlier in the video, one way to deal with externalities is by Pigovian tax. Pigovian tax is a tax levied on a market activity that generates negative externalities. The tax is intended to correct the market outcome. In the presence of negative externalities, the social cost of a market activity is not covered by the private cost of the activity. In such a case, the market outcome is not efficient and may lead to overconsumption of the product. A Pigovian tax equal to the negative externality is thought to correct the market outcome back to efficiency. And the example I have is behind me, the power plant. The EPA could levy a tax of $30,000 on this power plant for every ton of pollution it emits. To sum it up, a Pigovian tax is a tax designed to induce private decision makers to take account of the social costs that arise from a negative externality. Another way to address the problem of externalities is through a subsidy. A subsidy is assistance paid to business or economic sector. Most subsidies are made by the government to producers or distributed as subventions in an industry to prevent the decline of that industry, or an increase in the prices of its products, or simply to encourage it to hire more labor. Examples are subsidies to encourage the sale of exports, subsidies on some foods to keep down the cost of living, especially in urban areas, and subsidies to encourage the expansion of farm production and achieve self-reliance in food production. And again, another example is the power plant behind me. the government can give them tax breaks in their efforts to find a solution on minimizing pollution. The last way to address the problem of externalities is through tradable permits. In 1975, tradable permits were first implemented in the United States to control industrial air pollution. It is a market-based approach used to control pollution by providing economic incentives for achieving reductions in the emissions of pollutants. A central authority, which is usually the government, sets a limit or a cap on the amount of pollutant that may be emitted. The limit or cap is allocated or sold to firms in the form of emissions permits, which represent the right to emit or discharge a specific volume of the specified pollutant. Firms are required to hold a number of permits equivalent to their emissions. The total number of permits cannot exceed the cap, limiting total emissions to that level. Firms that need to increase their emission permits must pay permits from those who require fewer permits. The transfer of permits is referred to as trade. In effect, the buyer is paying charge for polluting, while the seller is being rewarded for having reduced emissions. Thus, in theory, those who can reduce emissions most cheaply will do so, achieving the pollution reduction at the lowest cost to society. In the United States, there is a national market to reduce acid rain and several regional markets in nitrogen oxides. And once again, my example will be the power plant. If they don't pollute as much as another power plant does, they can sell them their tradable permits and both sides will be happy.
In short, tradable permits limit the production of negative externalities.